Okay, good evening. It is time to continue on with the problem of slavery in the age of revolution. Tonight we're going to do the second part of the ninth chapter. I am going to have to break it into three total parts just for this one chapter because it's so insanely long. So I'm going to just pick right up where we left off, and I already have my um, goal page picked out. So here we go. So this chapter is titled The Preservation of English Liberty 2. So you had two chapters on the preservation of English liberty. We are on page 414. As events would prove, the abolitionists were right when they doubted both the ability and willingness of West Indians to smooth the way toward emancipation. Prompted in part by a memory of Ellis's resolutions of 1797, Wilberforce would warn Buxton in 1826 that it would be, quote, nothing less than treachery to the cause if all our chief friends were not with one concurrent voice to declaim against the utter hopelessness of any honest cooperation from the colonial assemblies, end quote. On the other hand, by insisting on the priority of the slave trade even when they attacked the entire slave system, the abolitionists became trapped by their own untenable assumptions. Their early reliance on slave trade abolition was wedded to laissez faire ideology in a way that precluded any legislation to improve the condition of West Indian slaves. Thus, prior to 1818, Wilberforce repeatedly emphasized the unenforceability of laws regulating slaves' food and clothing, the hours of their labor, their punishments, their medical care, or their education. In a highly revealing passage, he asked, quote, put the case of a similar law applicable to servants in this country, how impossible would it be found to enter into the interior of every family, and with more than inquisitorial power to ascertain the observance or the breach of the rules which should have been laid down for our domestic economy. But supposing the means of enforcing the regulations to be found, how odious, how utterly intolerable would such a system be found in its execution? End quote. This position ruled out plans like the one proposed to Parliament in 1796 by Philip Francis, who called on the government to ensure that slaves be guaranteed their own land, that conflicts with masters be settled by arbitration, and that slaves be allowed to develop their own legal and social institutions. It also shut the door on tactics which Wilberforce and Clarkson came finally and reluctantly to accept. As they looked into the future, the abolitionists distinguished two ethical dispensations. They expected nothing from the West Indians' self interest prior to abolition, but everything from such self interest after abolition. In Clarkson's words, the end of slave importations would force the planters to, quote, find that resource within themselves which their avarice has taught them to reject, and they must immediately turn a system of calculated oppression and murder into that of lenity, tenderness, and preservation. End quote. Wilberforce took up the same theme. Quote, all ideas of supply from without being utterly cut off, it would immediately become the grand, constant, and incessant concern of every prudent man, both proprietor and manager, to attend in the first instance to the preservation and increase of his negroes. Whatever may have been the case in the instance of men at once both liberal and opulent, the mass of owners have, practically at least, gone upon the system of working out their slaves in a few years and recruiting their gangs with imported Africans. The abolition would give the death blow to this system. The opposite system, with all its charities, would force itself on the dullest intellects, on the most contracted or unfeeling heart. Ruin would share a man would stare a man in the face if he did not conform to it, end quote. In other words, the sin of avarice was responsible for a brutal system of exploitation, but the desire for profit would force planters to breed and nourish their domestic labor force. And as they discovered, quote, the waste incidental to the providence, pro, the waste incidental to the providing sustenance for large numbers, end quote, the planters would soon see advantage in leaving it, quote, in the power of each individual to sustain himself more cheaply, end quote. The blacks would thus gain their freedom as the planters grew richer. Economic ruin would be the fitting penalty for any planter who disregarded the laws of benevolence and of Adam Smith. This position necessitated a fairly sanguine view of slavery in the United States, despite all that had been said in 1776 about the whip brandishing Sons of Liberty. Henry Brougham, for example, cited Jefferson's Notes on Virginia for evidence that a cutting off of slave imports would lead to better treatment and to a rapid natural increase in the Negro population. As a group, the British abolitionists found it virtually impossible not to interpret North America's growing Negro population as evidence that slavery itself was in the process of melioration and rapid extinction. It was thus not altogether coincidental that British disillusionment over their own original tactics came with a belated recognition of the severity and geographic expansion of slavery in the United States. Wilberforce's expectations seem to have been related to his larger assumptions concerning the triumph of practical Christianity over original sin. By striking the evil at its root, the reformers would allow the natural growth of a new operative principle, quote unquote, somewhat comparable to grace, which would ensure to self-interest benevolent effect. Wilberforce, ugh, Will I can't say his name tonight. Wilberforce hoped that the conversion of the English upper class to evangelical religion would lead to the moral regeneration of domestic society. He placed similar reliance on the influence of absentee proprietors whose motives the act of abolition would immediately transform. The key mechanism in both instances would be moral example reinforced by economic power. After abolition, the quote unquote credit and character of each plantation manager would depend on increasing the stock of blacks, quote, not as hitherto on the immediate and clear returns from the estate, end quote. And as absentee landlords took a closer interest in the well being of their property, the cumulative effect would amount to a moral transformation of West Indian society. Quote, the settlements of families, the discouragement of adultery, the countenancing by example as well as precept among bookkeepers or overseers or of morality and decency. End quote. It would now be clear that the tactical decision to attack the slave trade carried profound ideological meaning. Although Sharp and other writers continued to denounce the unlawfulness of slave holding, the movement's leaders attributed the evils of slavery to the available supply of new labor, not to exploitation itself. As pointed out by the Christian Observer, the organ of the evangelical party, quote, they who affirm that nothing may be tolerated which occasions robbery and murder must not only emancipate our slaves in the West Indies, but raise our great cities and fire our mines and manufactories. The abolitionists, however, are not chargeable with this paradox. End quote. Manufactories. I've never seen it written that way. The abolitionists embraced a different paradox. God had prohibited the commission of certain crimes, not institutions that might provide the occasion for crime. The slave trade was inseparable from the commission of crime and was therefore, quote, the greatest practical evil which has ever afflicted the human race. These were actually Pitt's words from the debate of 1792. Oh, that was of the quote was the greatest practical evil which has ever afflicted the human race. End quote. And then he says these were actually Pitt's words from the debate of 1792. This rather forced distinction between Wilberforce. Wow. This rather forced distinction allowed Wilberforce to declare that slaves were entitled to the blessing of liberty, but then to liken them to unfortunate prisoners who had been, quote, driven into a state of utter madness, which required out of charity salutary restraint and even the harsher expedient of wholesome discipline, end quote. The distinction allowed Brougham to say more frankly that Negro labor would long be essential for West Indian cultivation, that such labor would require coercion, though not maltreatment, and that abolition would force the West Indian legislatures to pass ameliorative laws. Quote, of their superior ability to devise and execute such measures we cannot entertain the smallest doubt. End quote. But a few abolitionists did express doubt over the naivete and inflexibility of official doctrine. James Stephen, Wilberforce's well informed brother in law, knew that profits and amelioration would not mix. Quote, would to God, he exclaimed, that the interest of the master were really so involved in the well being of the slave as has been asserted and admitted in Parliament. End quote. Maltreatment, he insisted, was not confined to a few cruel or indignant masters, nor could one expect even on the best regulated estates that the planter's self-interest would reduce excessive hours of labor or increase, quote, the ordinary subsistence which is far too small, end quote. In 1802, Stephen predicted that nothing less than direct parliamentary intervention would be required. Quote, when an efficient moving power shall be obtained, it will be time enough to consider how the parts of the machinery may be best constructed and applied. End quote. During the next few years, Stephen himself would work quietly and efficiently toward the creation of that, quote, efficient moving power, end quote. A confirmed Tory, he had the good fortune to be close to Spencer Perceval and Lord Liverpool. The latter secured him a seat in the Commons in 1808. More important, in 1811 he was appointed Master in Chancery, and in 1813 his son James became legal counselor to the colonial office. It was James Jr., later to become permanent Undersecretary of the Colonial Office, who finally drafted the 1833 Act of Emancipation. And as early as 1815, Clarkson had learned the, quote, melancholy lesson that whereas the abolition of the slave trade ought in common prudence to have secured better treatment to the slave, yet such is the force of custom and prejudice that legislative authority is actually necessary to produce so desirable an end. End quote. The colonial legislatures had quote unquote forfeited their charter and quote unquote must be compelled to obey reason. And then yet another quote. Quote, they must be ever awed by the public vice, end quote. And in 1830, Clarkson would confess that abolitionists had been deceived in their first expectations. And we have a very long quote here. Quote, we supposed that when by the abolition of the slave trade the planters could get no more slaves, they would not only treat better those whom they then had in their power, but that they would gradually find it to their advantage to emancipate them. We did not sufficiently take into account the effect of unlimited power on the human mind. No man likes to part with power, and the more unbounded it is, the less he likes to part with it. Neither did we sufficiently take into account the ignominy attached to a black skin as the badge of slavery, and how difficult it would be to make men look with a favorable eye upon what they had looked upon formerly as a disgrace. Neither did we take sufficiently into account the belief which every planter has that such an unnatural state as that of slavery can be kept up only by a system of rigor, and how difficult, therefore, it would be to procure a relaxation from the ordinary discipline of a slave estate. End quote. Yet the original assumptions had served an important political purpose. The British attempt to control West Indian slavery by prohibiting further slave imports bore certain parallels with the later American attempt to contain the peculiar institution by prohibiting its expansion into the Western territories. Thus, the early British abolitionists were content with a compromise that resembled latter the later anti-slavery position of American free soilers and Republicans. Like the Americans, the British disavowed any intention of interfering with slavery where it had long existed, though in both instances slaveholders had reason to suspect the disavowals. Once contained, the institution would no doubt wither and disappear, that is, if slaveholders knew their own best interest. And if this faith really amounted to a containment of moral protest, it allowed anti-slavery sentiment to be assimilated to the political process. The differences, however, are more revealing than the similarities. Unlike most of the American free soilers and Republicans, the British abolitionists genuinely wished to improve the life of Negroes and mistakenly thought that amelioration would rapidly undermine the institution of slavery. Yet in England, during the first phase of the anti-slavery movement, the governing classes accepted an expedition, the abolition of the slave trade, that virtually required further intervention if planters failed to conform to abolitionist expectations. In America, the compromise of containment emerged as the final expedient after a long official conspiracy of silence, quote unquote, and of course the compromise demand to exclude slavery from the territories provoked a crisis which succeeded in destroying the entire slave regime. In the 1790s, however, it was quite inconceivable that the English government, or the government of any imperial nation, would adopt an emancipationist program like the one proposed by Philip Francis. Abolition of the slave trade was hardly more conceivable unless jointly agreed to by the principal maritime powers. Even the debates on slave trade regulation in 1788 raised explosive issues of national interest. In return for extremely moderate regulations, Pitt agreed to compensation for financial loss as well as to government bounties for the preservation of lives. And for this token victory, he faced abuse from members of his own cabinet and party and was finally forced to threaten a cabinet crisis. On the other hand, the spontaneous loyalty that supports class hegemony is always the product of a subtle interaction between rulers and the ruled. During the American Revolution, the domestic turmoil in England had sharpened suspicions of ministerial corruption, given an edge to the grievances of the disenfranchised, and created a need for new symbols of legitimacy. Nor could any political faction safely ignore the growing sensitivity of the middle class. including, it should be stressed, middle-class women, to humanitarian issues. Thus, in 1788, Pitt realized that the political value of an anti-slavery measure might justify certain short-term sacrifices. And in May of that year, when Wilberforce was incapacitated by serious illness, and when Parliament received over 100 petitions against the slave trade, Pitt's leadership was put to the test. Various factions in the House of Commons tried to seize the slave trade issue from Pitt's grasp, or failing that, to strand him in an embarrassing position. The politics of abolition involved a collective definition of vital interests, but what precisely did this mean in practice? In the first place, it meant that both the opponents and defenders of the slave trade accepted the rules of parliamentary procedure and assumed that Parliament was the scene where the issue would be decided. And though each side accused the other of procrastination, they both welcomed the formal hearing of evidence, which became a kind of choric ritual as a means of delaying action and mobilizing votes. Everyone understood the critical importance of timing. In January 1788, Wilberforce expected a quick and easy victory, in part because of optimistic reports from France, in part because of his confidence in Pitt's support. By May, however, after Pitt's Privy Council Committee for Trade and Plantations had heard testimony from prestigious admirals, the slave trade faction was equally confident. Like the Abolition Committee, the West Indian merchants and planters were unsure of Pitt's intentions. They hoped, however, that an early discussion and vote in the House of Commons would put an end to further agitation. Thus began a long game of calculating the most favorable time to stop examining or cross-examining witnesses, a game that would be transferred to a select committee of the House and to the House of Commons itself. During 1790 and 1791, the West Indian faction generally opposed excessive delays and pressed for early votes. On occasion, however, they reached agreement with Wilberforce on postponing debate. The great slave trade investigations embodied the spirit of the scientific Enlightenment. They gave expression to the desire to question traditional assumptions, to gather a multitude of facts, to weigh evidence, and to reject unprovable claims, including those arising from humanitarian zeal. The abolitionists were embarrassed by the moral character and social status of many of their witnesses. The West Indians were embarrassed by the difficulty of finding disinterested witnesses. Yet each side was confident that testimony had unmasked the hypocrisy of their opponents and had revealed the nation's true best interest. From a psychological perspective, the investigations can be seen as a ritual of expiation that temporarily exorcised the slave trade's worst evils. For surely it was morally preferable for MPs to shudder at a recital of horrors than to pretend that the evils did not exist. Wilberforce's calling of witnesses, quite apart from the timing of votes, helped to prolong a public catharsis. Wilberforce kept insisting that abolition itself would involve no greater sacrifice than did the public catharsis. Quote, "Here you can do good by wholesale and at no expense. You may enrich others and be yourselves no poorer." End quote. In his memorable speech of May 12, 1789, he read from a document that echoed the West Indian merchants' predictions of economic ruin. Then he informed the House that it had been written in 1774 and concerned the loss of the North American colonies, which occurrence, as it turned out, had hardly impoverished Great Britain. Yet apart from profits and losses, the investigations did raise a fundamental principle of economic enterprise. As pointed out by Robert Norris, who supplied Clarkson with information on Africa and who then became a leading witness and propagandist for the slave traders. Quote, the principle which has raised the commerce and navigation of this country, and with them the landed interest and revenues of the kingdom, from inconsiderable beginnings to their present greatness, is the right which every man in it possesses to carry on his own business in the way most advantageous to himself and the society, without any sudden interruption in the pursuit of it, and the consciousness which he has of the steady protections of the laws in the prosecution of what has been shown to be legal. End quote. This line of argument struck a far more vital nerve than did Fox's refutation of Aristotle or Clarkson's discussions of Pomponius and Cicero. It was one thing to dissociate the slave system from the rest of the economy, to make it a symbol of all oppression, and to provide Parliament with the chance to prove, as Pitt would have it, that nations are bound by the laws of morality. But no governmental action could be allowed to undermine the public's faith that there would be no sudden interruption in the pursuit of enterprises long sanctioned by Parliament. A considerable amount of capital had been invested in land, slaves, and shipping, on the assumption that the African trade would continue, and one senses that the issue of public trust carried greater weight than did conflicting evidence on the slave trade's value to the national economy. Public trust had to be balanced, however, against the moral pretensions of government, against the desire to prove that government could be a vehicle for what Clarkson termed in the rhetoric of the age, quote, that divine sympathy which nature has implanted in our breasts for the most useful and generous of purposes, end quote. Even opponents of abolition, such as London's Alderman Nathaniel Newnham, felt it necessary to defend their humanitarianism before the House of Commons. Stephen Fuller, I'm not sure which it is, acknowledged the political potency of anti-slavery when he warned that Fox might take the cause from Pitt's hands in order to regain support from dissenters and disillusioned Whigs. Certainly Fox embarrassed both Pitt and Wilberforce by assimilating the public demand to his own theories of political reform, and by defining the issue as a clear-cut struggle between expediency and justice. He claimed that Pitt's move to delegate investigation to the Privy Council Committee deprived the people's representatives of their constitutional right to hear petitions and examine evidence. The slave trade could never survive open debate. Its abolition would be prevented only by stifling inquiry. Yet we must not, Fox warned, confuse the slave trade question with the more partisan issues, including even political freedom. Though he had always championed political liberty, this, quote, great blessing sinks to nothing when compared with personal freedom, end quote. On a question of crime, there could be no compromise. When Henry Addington recommended a bounty for transporting more female slaves, Fox thought it tantamount to asking the government to pay for kidnapping and murder. William Belsham, a prominent Unitarian Whig, had written that any honest man presented with the bare facts of the slave trade would have to agree it was a crime. Surely public virtue had progressed beyond the point of requiring a formal train of argument to prove the traffic to be, quote, the height of moral and political depravity, end quote. Fox agreed with this view that the issue transcended politics and foreclosed serious debate. Should his fellow MPs reject abolition, he said in 1791, having been informed of the slave trade's true nature, this would be, quote, more scandalous and more defaming in the eyes of the country and the world than any vote which any House of Commons had ever given, end quote. Fox's rhetorical strategy placed an uncomfortable burden upon Parliament. He more than implied that a responsible government must follow the lead of disinterested public opinion. And when he and other speakers tried to elevate the slave trade question above the gamesmanship of politics, they in effect raised the stakes of the game and transformed defeat into a simple triumph of avarice that discredited the political order. In the debates of April 1791, Pitt himself insisted that the issue transcended politics and even humanitarian feeling. It was a test of nothing less than whether the laws of morality were binding on nations. Lord Carysfort observed that any doubts he might have had were removed by the manner in which abolition had been opposed. Not one solid argument had been given in favor of the trade. When several members snickered at William Smith's tale of a slave ship atrocity, Smith indignantly replied that he would have thought such unfeeling impossible, that he was almost ashamed of sitting in an assembly where such a disgrace could occur. Yet despite the eloquent speeches of 1791, despite the coalition of great names, the House gave a crushing defeat to Wilberforce's motion to introduce an abolition bill. Afterwards, William Romilly brooded that, quote, nothing can be more disgraceful to the nation than such a decision after so long an inquiry, too, end quote. Even defeat, however, did not necessarily impair the ideological function of debate. The discouraging delay of 1789 was perhaps less memorable than the tides of eloquence. Burke, who received admiring praise himself, compared Wilberforce to Demosthenes. The expressions of humanitarian sentiment caused James Martin to remark that he was now prouder of being an Englishman than ever before. In spite of Parliament's failures, Wilberforce could express satisfaction in 1792 to see the effects of a great public movement, to see, quote, so great and glorious a concurrence, to see this great cause triumphing over all lesser distinctions, and substituting cordiality and harmony in the place of distrust and opposition, nor have its effects amongst ourselves been in this respect less distinguished or less honorable. It has raised the character of Parliament, end quote. So the moral cause, however unsuccessful in achieving its ostensible objective, had at least raised the character of Parliament. Even more important, it had taught the English people and other nations that, quote, there is a point of elevation where we get above the jarring of the discordant elements that ruffle and agitate the veil below. In our ordinary atmosphere, clouds and vapors obscure the air, and we are the sport of 1,000 conflicting winds and adverse currents. But here we move in a higher region, where all is peace and clear and serene, free from perturbation and discomposure, end quote. And here Wilberforce pleaded on, quote, this august eminence, let us build the temple of benevolence, end quote. Even in a speech aimed at conciliation and compromise, it is remarkable to find the movement of abolition described as, quote, substituting cordiality and harmony in place of distrust and opposition, end quote. But one must understand that for Wilberforce, the abolition movement was only one prong of a vast religious crusade to reform an unregenerated social order by first infusing government with the spirit of Christian morality. Thus Wilberforce often lamented that his friend Pitt had not felt the call of serious religion, which would have allowed Pitt, as prime minister, to exercise his enormous patronage in church and state, leading to a, quote, descending series of official appointments, end quote, of truly pious men until, quote, religious and moral secretions, end quote, permeated the entire body politic as well as the private spheres of life. This was Wilberforce's great dream, a downward diffusion of evangelical piety channeled through the structures of power. But Wilberforce could at least take comfort from Pitt's sincere commitment against the slave trade. This was the one issue that could unite men of goodwill, regardless of party or religious persuasion, and thus serve as a touchstone for measuring the moral regeneration of power. Historians have generally interpreted the parliamentary struggle for abolition either as a contest between humanitarianism and selfish interests, or as a contest between opposing economic interests, one of which wore a humanitarian mask. The key questions from either viewpoint involve Pitt's moral integrity and the political feasibility of an abolition law, especially prior to Britain's declaration of war in 1793. For our purposes, however, the responsibility for defeat or delay is of less significance than the symbolic meaning of the Compromise of April 3rd, 1792. Before turning to the event itself, it is well to summarize some of Richard Parris's penetrating observations on the nature of British politics in the reign of George III. As Perez, I guess I'm going to say Perez, writes, quote, "The government existed in those days not in order to legislate, but in order to govern, to maintain order, to wage war, and above all to conduct foreign affairs," end quote. It was a government dominated by local oligarchies and local interests, by family alliances and personal connections. The House of Commons founded its claim in supremacy, quote, "on its historical function as a check on the crown," end quote. The prestige and authority of the Commons arose from its supposed independence of judgment and from its, quote, virtual representation of an unidentified community of interests and sympathy in feelings and desires, end quote. In the slave trade debates of 1792, for example, Pitt took exception to Fox's insistence that it was the House's duty to respond to public opinion. No doubt the petitions were sincere, Pitt said, and testified to the humanity and benevolence of the English people. He had already begun to suppress public meetings. Yet the Prime Minister assured the House that he would oppose the slave trade even if all the petitioners supported it. One could never barter justice for popular clamor. The House of Lords, the House of Lords, Perez pointed out, was considered as, quote, "an occasionally useful long stop in the game of cricket, a kind of backstop, which could be perfectly relied upon to reject any measure which the ministry could not or durst not resist in the Commons." This was particularly true of bills or motions which the members of the House of Commons were obliged to patronize because the electorate and the public generally were known to favor them, end quote. In April 1792, it was clear that another crushing rejection of abolition would seriously discredit the House of Commons in the minds of thousands of the most respectable petitioners. The nation had been saturated with anti-slavery literature. The cause had won the support of local dignitaries and of the clergy, especially in Scotland and the north of England. A movement to boycott slave-produced rum and sugar was well underway. On March 16th, King Christian VII of Denmark set England an example of benevolence by allowing his subjects only one more decade to transport slaves from Africa to the Danish colonies. He also encouraged foreigners to help stock the colonies with slaves. Most important, the House of Commons had not only accumulated a vast body of evidence, but in effect had defined the issue as a test of its own moral legitimacy. On the other hand, the passage of an actual abolition law might have shaken public confidence in the security of property, given encouragement to more radical reforms across the Channel. The Girondins, led by the abolitionist Brissot, were preaching a war of liberation, and aroused the slaves in the British islands to follow the lead of their French brothers. An uprising had already occurred in British Dominica. Apart from the House of Lords' quote, spontaneous dislike of all change, end quote, to borrow Perez's happy phrase, the very idea of abolition was anathema to the Chancellor Lord Thurlow, who had been asked by the king to exercise joint leadership with Pitt, his bitter enemy. It was equally repugnant to the young Duke of Clarence and to the king himself, who was apparently determined to keep Pitt from making abolition a cabinet measure. 4 years later, in 1796, the king wrote to Henry Dundas, Pitt's shrewd confidant and party manager, venturing the opinion that the prime minister's arguments against the slave trade were not of his own quote-unquote sterling growth, but it had been hatched by others. Some of Pitt's powerful supporters seem to have regarded his abolitionism as an unfortunate foible and considered it no disloyalty to rescue him from the awkward bind produced by his friendship with Wilberforce. The Compromise of April 3, 1792 can be quickly summarized. On April 2nd, Wilberforce asked the House to resolve that the slave trade, quote, ought to be abolished, end quote. According to Roger Anstey's calculations, the Commons contained in the 1790s approximately the same number of hardcore abolitionists as West Indians and other more normally and others normally allied with the West Indian interests. The decisive swing vote hinged largely on definitions of national self-interest, particularly with respect to national power and the welfare of the larger British Empire. No figure was more influential in crystallizing opinion on such issues than Henry Dundas, who presided over colonial affairs as Pitt's Home Secretary, who sat as president of the East India Company Board of Control, and who, in Dale H. Porter's words, quote, controlled much of the patronage in both ends of the empire and influenced the votes of 34 Scots MPs and 11 Scots peers, end quote. Dundas replied to Wilberforce's proposal by arguing that the condition of West Indian slaves must be improved before imports from Africa could be stopped. He therefore moved to amend Wilberforce's motion by adding the word gradually. On the morning of April 3rd, the House accepted Dundas's amendment by a majority of 193 to 125, and then passed the resolution favoring gradual abolition of the slave trade by a vote of 230 to 85. Stephen Fuller, the Jamaican agent, was convinced that the West Indians would have had no difficulty maintaining a majority in the Commons if Henry Dundas had not moved the surprise amendment. Dundas's motives aroused the suspicions of his contemporaries and of later historians, but will probably never fully be known. Fuller had long been warning him that continuing debates on the slave trade would inevitably turn Jamaica into another St. Domingue. It was imperative, Fuller had earlier pleaded, for governmental leaders to put, quote, an immediate and decisive stop to the agitation by taking the sense of Parliament upon it, by such means as they shall think proper upon the first open day after the meeting of the 1792 session, end quote. On February 1st, Fuller complained to Bryan Edwards that only Pitt could stop Wilberforce from introducing a new motion, but that Pitt would not do so because of his own consistency. In fact, Pitt tried to persuade Wilberforce to postpone his motion, but without success. More significant, however, was Fuller's report to Jamaica that Dundas wanted to bring a speedy end to parliamentary discussion of the slave trade, but was at a loss to know how to do so. Although Dundas's motion pleased neither the West Indians nor the abolitionists, it precisely answered the needs of Parliament, which could now become a quote unquote temple of benevolence without sanctioning a sudden interruption, quote unquote, in the pursuit of business. Dundas's plea for moderation allowed Fox to declaim to the crowded galleries, asking whether murder and theft were more justified when done with moderation. Pitt, in what was generally regarded as the most eloquent speech of his career, talked of the forgiveness of heaven, quote, the guilt and shame with which we are now covered, end quote, and of the sublime prospect of civilizing Africa as a means of national redemption. If Parliament had decided that the slave trade was unjust, he asked, quote, why ought it not to be abolished by the vote of this night, end quote. But Pitt also applauded the fact that the dispute had been narrowed to a mere difference over when the trade should end. By agreeing on the goal of ultimate abolition, the House had redeemed its moral character. The majority of members who voted for Dundas's amendment evinced a sensible fear of quote unquote hasty or precipitous action. But there could be no question that their hearts were in the right place. Okay. The Morning Chronicle hailed the vote as proof that the English Constitution provided sufficient vitality for the reform of every abuse without convulsion. Even abolitionist writers echoed this theme. The vote demonstrated the excellence of the Constitution, showed the beneficent effects of the people's right to petition, and pointed to the legal and successful method of accomplishing every political improvement. Yet the House of Commons still faced the embarrassing question of what was being amended, since no bill had been proposed, and since Dundas had talked vaguely of ameliorative regulations, the most important of which would depend on the West Indian legislatures as a means of slowly eliminating the need for further importations of slaves. Dundas had no intention of introducing a bill for gradual abolition, and Wilberforce refused to do so on grounds of moral principle. It was Fox who finally forced Dundas to offer a bill, and Pitt who finally secured the bill's passage. But when the House agreed in 1796 as a terminal date for the slave trade, Dundas completely dissociated himself from the measure. From then on, he not only actively opposed any renewal of abolitionist action, but in 1795 persuaded the House to postpone the desired terminal date until the end of the war with France. The Abolition Society voiced bitter disappointment over the supposed delay of 4 years, which ran counter to the will of the people as expressed in hundreds of petitions. They drew comfort, however, from the symbolic precedent. The House of Commons had officially declared itself in favor of abolition. In May 1792, Sir Samuel Romilly was confident that the House would vote for immediate abolition at its next session, and though the House of Lords would probably reject the first bill, quote, they will hardly venture to do so a second time, and they will certainly have a second bill sent to them. However sincere the Lords are in their zeal for slavery, they will hardly carry their sincerity so far as to endanger their own authority, and the cause of the Negro slaves is at present taken up with as much warmth in almost every part of the kingdom as could be found in any matter in which the people were personally and immediately interested. End quote. But the question of authority was precisely the point. Wilberforce understood the necessity of maintaining a delicate balance between public pressure and the authority of government. He acknowledged that all the great men in government hated public meetings, though in this instance abolitionists had sought the support of people, quote, of a better sort than the generality of such cattle, end quote. He accepted the verdict of Lord Grenville, who told him any attempt to influence the House of Lords would be, quote, an excess of zeal, end quote, that would seriously injure the cause. In 1793, the Commons refused to pressure the upper house by renewing the previous year's resolution. The West Indian merchants and planters never doubted that the Lords' examination of evidence would ensure prolonged delay and an ultimate killing of the bill. Wilberforce later admitted that the gradual abolition measure had had no chance of passing the House of Lords, and as he looked back upon the vote of 1792, he became convinced that it had not had the slightest effect on the final outcome of abolition. We're getting there. Yet the commitment to gradual abolition provided the government, including the Prime Minister, with a fund of moral capital that would not deplete for some years. Pitt kept assuring Wilberforce that the slave trade had received its sentence of death. The execution would be carried out as soon as the time was ripe. The conflict with France required national unity and the leadership of a strong political coalition, but the coalition unfortunately included many enemies of abolition. It was only sensible, therefore, to be content with the symbolic resolution of 1792, which would be commemorated by the ritual of Wilberforce's annual motions. According to the logic of gradualism, there was really no necessity for further action, since Pitt and Dundas had committed the government to the principle of abolition. The West Indians would be moved by self-interest to adopt reforms that would eventually render the slave trade obsolete. This was the assumption underlying the Ellis Resolutions of 1797 and the resulting recommendations sent to West Indian governors. The government policy could thus be described in modern jargon as the quote-unquote winding down of a national mistake. The Compromise of 1792 did entail certain risks. The House of Lords inaction evoked public criticism, which threatened to merge with the more radical spirit of discontent brought on by war and domestic oppression. In 1795, the London Abolition Committee dared to say that the members of the legislature, by rejecting the petitions of the people, quote, have taken the whole weight of the trade on themselves, end quote. In the same year, when Wilberforce privately concluded that the infamous vote of the Commons was an argument for parliamentary reform. For a brief time, it appeared that the boycott movement might undercut the government's control over abolitionism. Since 1787, a number of abolitionists had proposed a popular boycott of West Indian sugar and rum in the event that political action should fail. Though few middle-class Englishmen were prepared to forego sugar in their tea, East Indian sugar presented a possible substitute. And the prospect of public coercion through self-denial had particular appeal to the nonconformist conscience. Instead of directly challenging Parliament by creating an anti-Parliament of public conventions or associations, individual dissenters could abstain from sin-tainted produce and thus, by transcending law and government, bring the downfall of the slave system. It was the lowly consumer, wrote William Fox, who bore the guilt of the slave trade and who possessed the power to destroy it. For the consumer, a slave-grown sugar was not only a participant in crime, but an accessory to murder. They may hold it to our quote, they may hold it to our lips, Fox wrote, steeped in the blood of our fellow creatures, but they cannot compel us to accept the loathsome potion, end quote. Samuel Bradburn, a Methodist preacher, appealed in 1792 to the sense of disillusionment and powerlessness of the dissenting public. The quote, same usurping power that made men slaves, he warned, may endeavor to enslave you and your posterity, end quote. Bradburn claimed that 400,000 consumers had joined in the popular protest. Clarkson and William Dillwyn estimated the number at 300,000. One half of the abstainers were women. Bradburn noted, quote, who from might overcome right have no voice at present in these matters, end quote. The free produce pamphlets, which reached an audience of at least 100,000, were filled with subversive implications. For abolitionist leaders, they posed a critical problem of defining the boundaries of approved agitation. On June 20th, 1793, a meeting of the Abolition Committee, including Wilberforce, Sharp, and Clarkson, resolved to recommend that the public abstain from West Indian sugar and rum and appointed a subcommittee to draw up a plan of action. On August 13, the committee decided to suspend the recommendation and to suppress the plan. Wilberforce had earlier expressed fears that the boycott scheme was associated with the quote-unquote turbulent elements of the abolition movement and that the idea was certain to alienate moderates. He therefore favored holding the weapon in reserve until it might be used with effect by general concurrence, quote unquote. The weakness of the boycott movement, which, like most popular enthusiasms, was short lived, lay in its dependence on individual action. Abstention was presented as a moral alternative to political organization. At a time when all organization raised the specter of Jacobinism, and when any interference with British commerce could be interpreted as treasonous aid to the enemy. The Abolition Committee, by continuing to defer to parliamentary leadership, reinforced the image of British abolitionism as a force maintaining the existing political and constitutional structure. Almost. We got about 4 pages. It is true that opponents of abolition did their best to link the cause of Jacobin France and their view won favor in the House of Lords and among the courtiers who surrounded the royal family. But no one could deny that a profoundly non-Jacobin Commons had voted to outlaw the African trade, nor could one impeach Wilberforce's reputation as a stalwart loyalist who, if he opposed the war, nevertheless supported the harshest suppression of domestic disorder. In replying to the charge of Jacobinism in 1799, the Bishop of Rochester observed the abolitionists had never talked of the equality or the imprescriptible rights of man. They had strenuously upheld the existing gradations of society, objecting only to a power which no good king would claim. The British abolitionists, unlike the later American Garrisonians, were never pushed towards a position of independence and defiance, which would have allowed them to assimilate radical thought and to appeal for a broad coalition of all enemies of slavery. From the outset, anti-slavery organization was dominated by the strategic goal of parliamentary legislation. As a result, the movement acquired a sense of deference, of patience, and of self-discipline. But the dependence on Parliament also required an often painful acceptance of the government's terms and definitions. Thus, it became essential to believe that when the time was opportune, Pitt would redeem the pledge of 1792. It was essential to draw hope from the debates of 1796 and to assume the cause was gaining when it nearly won sanction for a second time in the lower house. The exigencies of war placed Wilberforce in an increasingly awkward position. His ability to symbolize disinterested benevolence was an asset both to Pitt and to the abolition movement. His friendship with the Prime Minister gave him supposed political leverage that enhanced his leadership among abolitionist followers. Yet Wilberforce's divided roles as politician and reformer were also a source of embarrassment for anyone concerned. Convinced that the political opposition, such as it was, posed threats to church and state, he could not become an outspoken critic. But as an independent supporter of the administration, he felt it his duty to protest lapses from anti-slavery principle. He remained convinced with some reason that Pitt sincerely desired abolition. The Prime Minister had simply been distracted by the emergencies of war and then seduced by Dundas, now the Secretary of War, into a number of unfortunate policies, such as the attack on St. Domingue, with the hope of suppressing the Black Revolt. The conquest of the rich lands of Dutch Guiana and Trinidad, and the use of slaves from the older British colonies to clear and settle plantations in St. Vincent and Trinidad. To his abolitionist friends, Wilberforce kept apologizing for Pitt. James Stephen, who was especially outraged over the plan for settling Trinidad, angrily wrote that Wilberforce had become, quote, the Moses of the Israelites, though at the same time the courtier of Pharaoh, end quote. A man whose political friends were the quote unquote high priests of Moloch could not escape responsibility. There could be no doubt that the government's war policies had given renewed sanction to Negro slavery, or that the destruction of St. Domingue had opened the way for a world sugar boom and for an increased demand for slaves, which was being met even in the even in the Spanish colonies by British ships. These events brought Wilberforce the keenest anguish, but always there was the memory of Pitt's great speech of 1792 and the hope that Providence would ultimately permit the Prime Minister to act on his own principles. Providence did not intervene in behalf of the abolitionists, but not early enough did intervene in behalf of the abolitionists, but not early enough to redeem Pitt's reputation as a reformer. The complex details of the abolitionist triumph had been freshly analyzed in a number of recent studies. It is sufficient to summarize a few salient points that help put the victory in wider perspective. One must first give a nod to the quote-unquote economic factors which at least made abolition conceivable to practical statesmen. By 1799, the supply of sugar temporarily began to outrun European demand, and within a few years the price had sunk to an unprecedented low. Planters in the older British colonies might hope for better times, but they could not be blind to the effects of competitive cultivation in the captured colonies of Guiana and Trinidad, where land was plentiful and far more fertile. Moreover, speculative investment in land and slaves might simply aid the development of colonies that would ultimately be restored on the precedent of the Treaty of Amiens to rival nations. And clearly, the easiest way to limit superfluous production was to cut off the flow of labor. By 1804, there had also been a decisive change in the goals and strategy of imperial conflict. Neither Britain nor France was prepared to squander further resources in a struggle to capture colonies that had proven to be financial and military burdens. The new Republic of Haiti symbolized the defeat of Napoleon's mercantilist dream of a French New World. The British, having achieved mastery in the Caribbean, could find neither adequate markets for their produce nor means of preventing their West Indian subjects from trading illicitly with the United States, which, as a neutral, reaped the rewards of carrying colonial staples to Napoleon's Europe. Even before Britain had won full naval supremacy, and it is worth remarking that the Battle of Trafalgar was not fought in the Caribbean, though both fleets had just dashed there and back, it was clear that the economic struggle would center not on the control of colonial production, but on the control of colonial commerce to European markets. By 1804, Britain had no need to fear a rival slave trade augmenting the productive capacity of her competitors. The crucial problem was not the supply of labor, but how to control the flow of colonial produce to Europe. But changing conditions did not automatically shatter the traditional balance of British politics. Pitt's resignation as Prime Minister after nearly 18 years in office might conceivably have freed abolitionists from the impasse occasioned by Wilberforce's personal loyalty to Pitt and by Pitt's constitutional scruples over making abolition a government measure. Yet Pitt, in deference to the king and in the interest of national stability, promised to support his successor, Henry Addington, who assumed office in March 1801 and whose cabinet the slave trading interest gained a stronger voice. By November 1801, the chief opposition leader, Charles James Fox, predicted that there would be no hope during the reign of George III of reforming Parliament, of repealing the Test Acts, or of abolishing the slave trade, and therefore concluded that his Whig followers should feel free to cooperate with Addington on terms of personal expediency. Wilberforce's independence from partisan factions gave him even greater freedom of maneuver and helped him during a succession of administrations to preserve his undisputed title as abolitionist leader. Yet his own hopes sagged when Addington failed in the peace negotiations at Amiens to press for international agreement in ending the slave trade. The time had seemed so opportune. And that is my stopping point. So, we made it. That is the second third of the ninth chapter, The Preservation of English Liberty 2. So I'll finish up the other third on Tuesday, and then hopefully the 10th and 11th chapters are a little shorter so I can get through them in one night, or at least only break them in half instead of three parts. But anyway, that is that. Let's see who is still around. We've got Mr. Blitzer playing Helldivers 2. We've got Vesper doing a flight simulator. Let me actually go over there real quick and see who's still doing anything. Okay, Mr. Blitzer's been on for 3.5 hours. I'm going to say he's probably ending fairly soon. Vesper's only been on for an hour and a half. So let's go on over to Vesper. I will take us over there and give him a minute of your time if you would, please. And I'll see you there. Oh, it's not letting me raid right now. For whatever reason, it, it's not letting me raid. So, we just won't. We'll just call it for the night then. Sorry about that. Have a good night.